The welder goes silent. The grinder stops spinning. And in that moment of stillness inside a rural Nova Scotia shop, everything seems to change. Anyone who has followed Bad Chad Hiltz knows that face. For years, viewers watched him turn rust, scrap metal, and forgotten car parts into rolling works of art. He built machines that seemed impossible, often without the expensive equipment or polished facilities that many professional builders rely on. What Chad had was vision, experience, determination, and an unmistakable ability to look at something most people would throw away and see what it could become. That attitude became the foundation of Bad Chad Customs and eventually turned a small Nova Scotia workshop into a name recognized far beyond the local car scene. Chad had always believed that his cars could make an impact. Early on, he talked about building machines that could shape the world, and for a while, it looked like that ambition was becoming reality. Then television changed everything. When Discovery Channel brought Bad Chad Customs to a wider audience, millions of viewers were introduced to Chad's unconventional approach to fabrication. There was no massive corporate garage, no perfectly organized production floor, and no guarantee that every project would go according to plan. There was simply Chad, his tools, his imagination, and a constant stream of impossible builds. He wasn't interested in making cars that looked ordinary. He wanted every project to have personality, attitude, and a story of its own. In 2019, that vision reached a much larger audience. Discovery Channel introduced viewers to the world of Bad Chad Customs, and suddenly the man who had spent years working away from the mainstream spotlight became a television personality. But what made the show different wasn't just the cars. It was Chad himself. His personality was impossible to manufacture. His frustrations, excitement, mistakes, arguments, breakthroughs, and last-minute decisions all became part of the experience. Viewers weren't simply watching someone build cars. They were watching Chad Hiltz try to turn impossible ideas into reality under enormous pressure. And standing beside him through much of that journey was Jolene. Their relationship became an important part of the Bad Chad story because Jolene wasn't simply someone appearing beside Chad on camera. She became closely connected to the business, the shop, and the life they were building together. While Chad focused heavily on the creative side of the operation, Jolene helped bring organization to a world that could quickly become chaotic. She understood the business side, helped manage the practical responsibilities, and became someone Chad could rely on while his attention remained fixed on the next build. Together, Chad and Jolene represented two very different sides of the same operation. Chad was driven by ideas, metal, machines, and the excitement of creating something that had never existed before. Jolene brought a different kind of stability. She understood the importance of planning, organization, communication, and keeping everything moving when Chad became completely absorbed in a project. Their partnership worked because their strengths were different. What one lacked, the other often helped provide. But television success came with a price. Every new episode meant another deadline. Every build had to move forward. Every problem happened under the pressure of cameras and an audience waiting for the final reveal. Custom fabrication is unpredictable by nature, but television production doesn't always allow room for unpredictability. A part can arrive late. A fabrication idea can fail. A design can change halfway through the project. Yet the cameras continue rolling and the deadline remains. Chad had to build cars while simultaneously building a television show around those cars. That pressure didn't exist only for Chad, it affected the entire environment around him, including Jolene. The shop had become more than a workplace. It was their business, their livelihood, and a huge part of their personal lives. When the cameras stopped, the work didn't stop. There were still bills, schedules, customers, employees, unfinished projects, business decisions, and countless problems that needed to be solved. The success people saw on television represented only one part of what was happening behind the scenes. As Bad Chad Customs became more recognizable, the expectations grew. Viewers wanted bigger builds. The network wanted more compelling episodes. The audience wanted the same unpredictable energy that had made Chad popular in the first place. But maintaining that level of intensity year after year is difficult for anyone. What begins as a passion can eventually become an enormous responsibility. For Chad and Jolene, the shop had become deeply connected to almost every part of their lives. There was also the challenge of protecting the identity they had created. Before Bad Chad became a recognizable television name, Chad had built an identity around his unique cars and the Green Goblin concept. That identity became closely associated with his work and his growing reputation. But branding issues and business changes forced Chad to adapt. The name and the business couldn't simply remain frozen in time. Like the cars he built, the company itself had to evolve. Then came another major disruption. The pandemic changed almost everything. Supply chains became unpredictable, parts became harder to obtain, schedules became more complicated, and production itself became difficult. For a builder whose entire philosophy depended on finding unusual materials and making things work, a world where supplies could suddenly disappear created a completely different challenge. The momentum that had helped Bad Chad Customs grow was suddenly much harder to maintain. Eventually, the television chapter became quieter. The show stopped moving forward in the way fans had expected, and questions began spreading across the internet. Where was Chad? What happened to Bad Chad Customs? Why weren't viewers seeing the same activity they had become accustomed to? And perhaps the biggest question of all was about Jolene. The woman who had been such a visible part of Chad's world became less present, and eventually her absence became impossible for longtime viewers to ignore. For fans, the change was confusing because there was no single dramatic announcement that explained everything. There was no simple moment where the audience was told, "This is what happened." Instead, things seemed to change gradually. The uploads changed. The shop atmosphere appeared different. The familiar dynamic people had watched for years was no longer the same. And when a relationship has been visible to an audience for so long, even small changes can become noticeable. For Chad and Jolene, however, the reality was likely much more complicated than anything that could be explained in a single video. Their lives had been connected through years of work, business, pressure, success, disappointment, and personal experiences that viewers could never fully see. The public saw the cars. They saw the shop. They saw the television episodes. But they could never see every private conversation, every difficult decision, or every moment when the pressure became too much. That is what makes the story of Bad Chad and Jolene so much more than a simple story about a television show ending. It is the story of two people who built something together and eventually found themselves facing changes they could not simply weld back together. Chad's world had always been about taking broken pieces and creating something new from them. But people are different from metal. You can't always grind away the damage, weld the pieces together, and make everything look new again. And that may be the most important part of Chad's story. The man who became famous for rebuilding old cars eventually had to face the fact that some things in life cannot be repaired by simply working harder. His career could change. His business could change. His television show could disappear. And his relationship with Jolene could enter a chapter neither of them expected. Yet Chad kept building. The cameras changed, the platforms changed, the business evolved, and the world around him moved forward. But inside that Nova Scotia workshop, the same basic philosophy remained. Find something other people have overlooked. Imagine what it could become. Pick up the tools and start working. And perhaps that is why the story of Bad Chad and Jolene continues to interest people. It isn't only about what happened to a famous car builder or why a familiar partnership changed. It's about what happens when two people spend years building a life and a business together, only to discover that success doesn't protect anyone from pressure, loss, or change. The cars may have introduced the world to Bad Chad Hiltz, but Jolene became part of the story behind the man. Their journey was built through years of shared work, shared responsibilities, and shared experiences. And whatever the future holds, that history cannot simply be erased because the cameras stopped recording it. The welder can start again. The grinder can begin spinning again. Another piece of metal can be shaped into something completely different. Chad has spent his entire life proving that. But some of the biggest changes in his life were never about the cars at all. They were about the people standing beside him, and what happens when those relationships begin to change. The people around Chad were a huge part of what made Bad Chad Customs work, and at the center of that world stood Jolene MacIntyre. She wasn't simply Chad's fiancée or someone appearing beside him on camera. She became one of the most important people behind the operation, helping keep the business organized while Chad focused on his creative ideas. Chad could look at a pile of scrap metal and immediately imagine a completely different machine, but turning those ideas into something that could actually be built, scheduled, and managed required another kind of skill. Jolene helped provide that balance. She handled the practical side of the business, helped organize the chaos, and supported the operation while Chad pushed his creativity to its limits. Their partnership was one of the reasons the Bad Chad world felt so different from a typical television car show. Chad brought the unpredictable creativity, while Jolene helped keep everything moving when projects became complicated. Together, they were building more than cars. They were building a business, a brand, and a life that had become increasingly connected to the cameras. The audience saw the finished vehicles and the dramatic moments, but behind every build were countless decisions, schedules, problems, expenses, and long hours that never made it into the final episode.